It was a perfect autumn in Chicago. The year was 1982. Kids were back in school, the Bears were getting ready to play, and people went about their lives. Then people started dying. And it wasn't a shooting or a car crash, it was something quiet. Something you'd never suspect. They were dying from Tylenol. It started with a 12-year-old girl named Mary Kellerman. She woke up with a cold. Her parents gave her an extra-strength Tylenol. She was dead by breakfast. In the same town, Arlington Heights, a man named Adam Janus took a Tylenol for a minor pain. He died. His brother and sister-in-law, Stanley and Teresa, rushed to his home to console the family. They were distraught, they had headaches, they reached into the same Tylenol bottle, and then they died too. 3 people from one family, dead in one day, from one bottle of Tylenol. Panic didn't even begin to describe it. The news spread like a virus. More victims turned up. Mary Reiner, who had just had a baby. Paula Prince, a flight attendant. Mary McFarland, a mother of 2. 7 people dead in the Chicago area, all from Tylenol capsules laced with potassium cyanide. Someone, a ghost, was walking into drugstores and supermarkets, putting poison on the shelves, and then just walking away. The police were lost. The scale of this was unbelievable. It wasn't a targeted attack. It was random terror. They had no motive, no suspect, no leads. They had nothing. The entire city, the entire country, held its breath. Tylenol was pulled from every shelf in America. The company Johnson & Johnson did the right thing. They initiated a massive recall, costing them over $100 million. But that didn't solve the mystery. It didn't catch the killer. The investigation was a huge, sprawling mess. Hundreds of detectives from local departments, state police, and the FBI were thrown into a task force. They were chasing shadows. They looked at disgruntled employees from the Tylenol factory. They looked at local weirdos. They interviewed thousands of people. Every lead went nowhere. The trail was ice cold. And then they got a letter. This is where the story turns. This is where the name James Lewis enters the picture. The letter was sent to Johnson & Johnson. It was an extortion letter. The writer demanded $1 million to stop killing her. It was typed, angry, and direct. It was the first solid thing the investigators had to hold on to. A motive. Greed. This wasn't just chaos, it was a shakedown. The letter gave them a name to chase. A name and a face. The man who wrote that letter was James Lewis. And for the next 40 years, he would be the shadow hanging over this entire case. The man everyone thought did it. The suspect they had. The suspect they let go. So, did the Chicago PD bungle the investigation? Did they have their man and let him slip through their fingers? It's not a simple yes or no. The truth is messier. It's a story about a very strange man, a desperate investigation, and the huge gap between suspecting someone and proving they're a killer. To understand James Lewis, you have to understand he wasn't your average criminal. He was smart, he was arrogant, and he had a dark past. Before the Tylenol murders, he was already on the authorities' radar, but for something else entirely. Back in the 1970s in Kansas City, a man named Raymond West was found dismembered. The Lewis had been his bookkeeper. West had accused Lewis of fraud, and then West turned up dead, his body parts mailed to his own home. The police in Kansas City looked hard at Lewis, very hard. The evidence was all circumstantial. That Lewis had bought the same type of rope used to tie the bags. He had access to the victim. But they couldn't place him at the scene. They couldn't prove he did it. He was a prime suspect, but he walked. It was a pattern that would repeat itself. Lewis was a chameleon. He used dozens of aliases. He was a tax accountant, but he was also a con man. He and his wife, Leanne, lived a transient life moving from city to city, always one step ahead of some trouble they'd created. By 1982, they were in Chicago. Lewis was running a small, failing mail-order business. He was angry. He felt the world owed him something. He was exactly the kind of person who might lash out. When the Tylenol letter arrived, the task force zeroed in on him. They traced the letter back to a post office box used by Lewis and his wife. They learned about his past in Kansas City. A picture started to form. Here was a man capable of violence, a man with a history of fraud, a man who felt wronged by the world. And now he was trying to extort $1 million from a company at the center of a national tragedy. The manhunt was on. It was a media frenzy. Lewis's face was plastered everywhere. He and his wife had already fled Chicago. They were on the run. The FBI found them a few weeks later in New York City. They had been hiding out in a library of all places, researching the Tylenol case. When they caught him, everyone thought this was it, the end of the nightmare. They had the Tylenol murderer, but they didn't. They had the extortionist, and that's a very different thing. This is the point where the question of a bungled investigation really comes into focus. The Chicago police and the FBI had their man in a room. They talked to him for hours. And James Lewis was a performer. He didn't confess. Instead, he played a game. He offered to help them. He drew them diagrams. He explained how the killer could have done it. He described how someone could buy the Tylenol, take it home, lace it with cyanide, and then return it to the shelves in different stores. To the investigators, this was a confession in disguise. He knew too much. He was taunting them. He was showing them how clever he was. But to a defense attorney, it was nothing. It was speculation. Lewis claimed he was just trying to give the police an idea of how to catch the real killer, and that he only wrote the letter to bring attention to his wife's former employer, whom he blamed for a workplace accident. It was a bizarre, self-serving story, but it wasn't an admission of murder. The investigators were stuck. They had him dead to rights on the extortion. The letter was his. His fingerprints were on it. He admitted to writing it. That was an easy conviction. A slam dunk. But the murder case? It was a go. They had no physical evidence placing James Lewis in any of the stores where the poison Tylenol was sold. No fingerprints on the bottles. No store clerk who remembered him. No one saw him tampering with the packages. They had no evidence he had ever purchased or possessed cyanide. And they had a huge problem with his timeline. Lewis and his wife swore they were in New York when the poisonings happened. They had hotel receipts and other documents that seemed to back this up. The timeline was tight, but it was possible he could have flown from New York to Chicago, done the deed, and flown back. Possible, but they couldn't prove it. A prosecutor can't go to a jury with possible. They need proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So the authorities made a choice. They had a bird in the hand. They could put Lewis away for extortion for a long time. The murder case was a long shot. It was all circumstantial. His weird help, his dark past, his extortion letter. It all painted a picture of a monster. But it didn't put the cyanide in his hands. They charged him with extortion. He was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. He served 13. The murder charges were never filed, and that was it. The biggest domestic terrorism case in American history, and their only real suspect was in jail for a different crime. Was this a bungle? From the perspective of the victims' families, it felt like it. The man everyone believed was the killer was going to walk free one day. From the perspective of the prosecutors, it was a calculated decision. A failed murder trial would have been a disaster. He could have walked away from everything. At least this way, he was off the streets for a while. The bungle, if there was one, probably happened long before James Lewis was ever caught. It happened in the first 48 hours. In the chaos of the initial response, crime scenes weren't perfectly preserved. The Tylenol bottles were handled by dozens of people, paramedics, police, coroners, before they were secured as evidence. The chance to find a clean fingerprint, a stray hair, a single fiber connecting a suspect to a bottle was likely lost in those first frantic hours. By the time the massive task force was assembled, the trail was already cold. Forensic science in 1982 was not what it is today. DNA analysis was the stuff of science fiction. The investigators did the best they could with the tools they had. They were overwhelmed. They were dealing with a crime that had no precedent. A killer who didn't need a gun or a knife, just a bottle of pills and a pharmacy shelf. While Lewis was in prison, the case file remained open, but it gathered dust. The task force was eventually disbanded. The detectives moved on to other cases. But the cloud of suspicion never left James Lewis. He was the bogeyman. Even after he was released from prison in 1995, he was the only name anyone ever talked about. He and his wife moved to Massachusetts. He tried to live a normal life, but it was impossible. He was the Tylenol murderer who got away. He even built a website, a strange, rambling platform where he proclaimed his innocence and called himself a victim. He tried to control the narrative, but he couldn't escape his past, and the police never really gave up on him. The case was officially cold, but not forgotten. In 2009, technology had finally caught up, and DNA testing was now a standard police tool. The FBI and Illinois State Police decided to take another run at the case. They got a search warrant and raided James Lewis's home in Cambridge. They descended on his apartment, seizing his computers, his papers, and boxes of his belongings. They took DNA samples from him and his wife. It was a huge news story. For a moment, it felt like there might finally be an answer. Maybe after all these years they would find something. A trace of something on an old document. A forgotten receipt. A partial DNA profile they could now match. The investigators were hopeful. They believed Lewis was their man, and now they had the science to prove it. But once again, it led to nothing. The evidence they collected didn't provide the smoking gun they needed. The DNA on the bottles had been contaminated over the years or was too degraded to be useful. There was nothing new that could definitively link Lewis to the cyanide. It was another dead end. Another moment of hope that fizzled into frustration. So, what does this all mean? Did they bungle it? The word bungle implies incompetence or a stupid mistake. What happened with the Tylenol case was more of a tragedy of circumstances. The police were faced with an impossible crime. They did find a suspect who was, by any measure, a terrible person. A con man, a likely murderer from a previous case, and a cold-blooded extortionist who tried to profit from mass murder. They didn't let him go. They put him in a cage for the crime they could prove. They had him. They just didn't have him for the right thing. Their failure wasn't in the interrogation room in New York. Their failure was a systemic one, born from the limitations of 1982 forensics and the sheer unprecedented nature of the crime. They couldn't connect the man to the poison. That's the whole story. Imagine being a detective on that case. You are sitting across from a man you are 99% sure is a mass murderer. He's toying with you. He's smarter than you think. He's arrogant. He's practically glowing with guilt. You can feel it. But you look down at your case file, and what do you have? A nasty letter. A history of being a bad guy, a shaky timeline, and a whole lot of gut feelings. Your gut feeling doesn't stand up in court, so you make a choice, you take the win you can get. You send him to prison for extortion, you hope that someday something new will come up. A witness will come forward, the suspect will confess to a cellmate, science will advance. You put the file on the shelf, but you never close it in your mind. For the Chicago PD, James Lewis was the one who got away. Not because he outsmarted them in a chase, but because he committed a crime so clean, so detached, that it left no traces of himself behind. He was a ghost, and maybe that was his plan all along. The extortion letter was so clumsy, so obvious, it was almost like he wanted to be caught for it. It created a perfect distraction. The whole world focused on James Lewis, the extortionist. They debated his guilt for decades. And in all that time, the real ghost, the person who actually put the poison in the bottles, was never looked for again. Lewis himself suggested this theory. He claimed the letter was a deliberate attempt to draw attention away from the real killer. It's a self-serving argument, of course, but it's not impossible. Could there have been another suspect? Early in the investigation, there were a few other leads. A man named Roger Arnold was investigated because he worked at a warehouse where cyanide was stored. He had a history of mental health issues, but he was eventually cleared. Another man, a Vietnam vet, was also briefly considered. But every other lead evaporated as soon as the Lewis letter appeared. The investigation developed tunnel vision. All resources, all focus went to James Lewis. If Lewis wasn't the killer, then the focus on him was the biggest bungle of all. It allowed the real murderer to melt back into society, forever anonymous. We'll probably never know for sure. James Lewis died in 2023. He was 76 years old. He went to his grave proclaiming his innocence in the Tylenol murder. His death officially leaves the case cold and almost certainly unsolved forever. There will be no deathbed confession, no final piece of evidence uncovered. The story ends with a question mark. The legacy of the Tylenol murders isn't just the 7 innocent people who died. It's the fear that it created. It changed the world. After 1982, you could no longer just trust that the products on a store shelf were safe. The crime led directly to the creation of tamper-proof packaging. Every foil seal on a bottle of medicine, every plastic wrap on a jar of food is a direct result of this case. The police investigation, bungled or not, stands as a landmark case in criminal justice. It showed the limits of traditional police work in the face of a new kind of anonymous random terror. It showed how a single compelling suspect can dominate an investigation for better or for worse. So, let's go back to the central question. Did the Chicago PD let their suspect go? Yes and no. They caught James Lewis, they convicted him, they put him in prison, but they couldn't pin the 7 murders on him. They let the murder suspect go because they had no choice. They didn't have a case. And that's the most frustrating truth of all. In the American justice system, it's not enough to know someone is guilty. You have to prove it. And against the Tylenol murderer, whoever he was, they just couldn't. The ghost won.